Greetings, friends, and welcome to this podcast episode for the podcast, Church Dismantled, a Kingdom Restored. I'm interviewing today Anita Garber, who is my guest, and Anita and I have talked several times about some really exciting work that you're involved with, Anita. And so I'm just really want to welcome you to the program today and invite you to just share the podcast, the book, anything else about yourself you want to. But I just think it's really exciting to see the direction you're going and how it's brought together so much of who you are and the passions you have into this really exciting calling that you've discovered that God's given you. So why don't you introduce yourself to us and then talk about your podcast and book project. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. So as Conrad said, my name is Anita Garber, and I'm currently a graduate student at Millersville University majoring in social work. This year, I have entered into adopted spaces as I am a transracial adoptee and have been on a journey of self-discovery, looking at grief and identity, belonging and intimacy and mastery and self-control, as those are typically referred to as the 7 core issues of adoption, including rejection. And the past 4 years, with everything happening both on the national and cultural levels, I've been come head to head with a lot of questions about who am I and what does it look like for me to accept being a Black woman in today's society and even in my own life. So out of that, I created a blog and a podcast that goes along with that, entitled Present Spaces, to engage in conversations about race, spirituality, and relationships so that we together can learn and grow and have hard conversations, but also create safe spaces where we've prioritized understanding one another and learning and growing together. And as Conrad mentioned, I am currently working on a devotional. The current title is called Rivers, Waves, and Waterspouts, Adoptees' Guide to Grief, Identity, and Belonging. So working you through 40 days of grieving and rejection and processing that, but also finding God in those spaces and having little activities. So like when we're grieving, we're going to lament, because I want adoptees or anyone else who picks up this book to be able to celebrate themselves in the midst of their process, in the midst of their mess, in the midst of whatever situation or circumstance is going on. I want them to say, I am worthy, I am valuable, I am enough, and I deserve to be celebrated, not only by those around me, but also by myself.
Anita, you used a lot of language there at the beginning, these 7 core, I'm not sure what you call them, principles of adoption. So I wonder if you could kind of touch on what some of those are, like mastery, and in your own words, what are a couple of these that are really important to you in your own journey that you've worked at? Because you got here in a particular way and through a particular path, and I'm not asking you to share anything you don't want to share, but there's always a biography here. There's always a story here. Our calling always includes that biography. So what can you share with us about what got you here and which of these are important to you?
I would say all of them are important.
Okay.
So they're, as I understand them, and I could be missing one or two, but I believe there's grief, loss, rejection, mastery and control, identity, and shame. I think that might be incorrect. But for me, the ones that if I would pick one, it's identity. If I would pick 2, it'd be identity and rejection, because I find that a lot of my entire life up to this point, I have been in one way or another trying to figure out who I am and what that looks like in my given circumstances, and also finding myself in relationships reacting because of a trigger response to something that feels like rejection based on my childhood, being adopted and having a reactive attachment disorder and some of those just nuanced experiences. And so for me, I I was looking back on my childhood and being like, what would have I needed, or what would have I appreciated if I, as a kid, that I didn't have? And I enter a lot of these spaces and I'm like, okay, so we all are looking for who we are. And so for me, the most practical way that it looks like is a devotional for whoever chooses to pick it up, because I feel like it's applicable to anybody, not just adoptees. And I'm writing it with another adoptee, and in the process, I've met with up to 10 persons involved in the adoptee triad. So that's either biological parents, adoptive parents, or adoptees. And the theme in all of those conversations is identity. Who am I? Who are we? How do we assist in cultivating and formation of these kids or adults' identity development? But for me, that's probably the theme of my life, is identity, both for me, but also helping other people and empowering other people to figure out who God has called them to be, who God has created them to be, and then giving them space and helping them recognize the tools that they have in order to move forward in that.
So can you say a little bit about if you're doing this as a devotional, you must believe God's in the midst of this somehow, Anita. Can you talk about how this has been part of a spiritual journey for you, how God has been with you in this, or how you've experienced God? Anything along those lines?
Clarification, how have I experienced God in the process of this project, or in my life leading up to this? Or both?
I would say both, because I'm sure God's been in both of them for you. So can you speak to both of those?
Yeah. I would say my first encounter with God, well, the one that stands out to me the most at the youngest age would be in second grade. We went to a worship service. And as a second grader, I was a very socially awkward, didn't really communicate well, didn't read social cues at all, was very insecure, and didn't really feel like I fit in anywhere. And I just remember sitting in the back of the church and feeling like I was okay, and I didn't have, that God was there, and that I was okay, and I didn't have to have any words in order to be good, in order to be good enough, in order to fit in order to be XYZ. There was no I's to dot or T's to cross or boxes to check. I could just be, and that was good. And for me at that point, that was the most important thing, to have a space to just be. And so that was significant in that. Since then, worship has been a safe place for me, because I feel like it's a space where I can breathe, and it's a space where I can just be. After that, I would say an encounter with God. I had a near-death experience when I was 13. It was a near drowning experience at Cape Henlopen National Park in Delaware. And I remember it was September, and so it was off season. There were no lifeguards, and we ran down the boardwalk and into the water, and there was a 3-foot drop off. But having gone swimming lessons for years and years and years, I was like, oh, we got this. But there was a point after going up and down after a while, I was like, life as I know it is over. And I said, God, I know my parents are logical people and they believe in you, so there has to be something to this. I said, so I'll make you a deal. You save me, I'll do anything, go anywhere. And the next thing I knew, I was being dragged towards shore. Mm-hmm. And so that set me on on a journey of, okay, God, you exist, you saved me, but why? Why on earth am I here? And so that was my high school journey, was like, I need to know, my search for purpose, I can honestly say, was probably the only thing keeping me alive in high school, because I was like, wow. God exists, and I'm here for a reason, and he saved me, but I need to know why. And so that went through, I don't know, I was suicidal during high school. And so I remember at camp, I went to Camp Hebron for a week, which is a camp outside of Halifax. And I had a plan to kill myself. And had it all sorted out, knew what I was going to do. I was walking down the hill, and my dad was coming up the hill to pick us up. And the camp pastor walks up to me. He says, Anita, do not do what you're thinking of doing. You mean more than you know, and God has a plan for your life. But do not do what you're thinking of doing. And I was like, I didn't tell anyone what I was going to do, and how, and that happened. That kind of situation happened at least 4 times during high school. And so I was like, okay, God, you have my attention. I don't know. I don't know what you want me to do, but you have my attention. And so after high school, I took a gap year and spent a year in Johnstown with Mennonite Mission Network. I worked at a Head Start program during the day and an after-school program, working with at-risk children and youth. And we were supported that year by 9 different churches. And so I had the opportunity to do street evangelism multiple days throughout the week. And that was a great year in that I saw God and I saw God in so many different places and so many different people. And it birthed in me a desire to go overseas and go to an unreached people group. And so I came home after that year and was like, okay, I'm going overseas for the rest of my life. How do I do that? And so I connected with an organization and got approved to go. And I just needed some form of biblical certificate or education. And so I chose to go to Rosedale Bible College for the next 2 years. And those 2 years, I would say, were the best 2 years of my life. God really solidified that part of my calling is to empower people to connect and communicate with Him, and also to find healing. At that time, I didn't have a really specific vehicle for what that looks like, but that was clear, and that for me was good. In the past 6 years, I would say that's been honed a lot as I've engaged. I did a bachelor's degree at Messiah University in social work, and I'm now in my master's degree in social work. And I'm finding that, yes, the calling on my life is to empower people to realize who they are. And for me, that looks like connecting with God and other people, and cultivating spaces where they can explore the invitation to know God and what that looks like. And so I feel like this book is just an extension of that. It's talking to people like me as a kid or me as an adult and saying, hey, you are celebrated. And I think for me, looking back on my life, God has been my number one champion. He celebrates me even when I don't want to be celebrated, when I don't know, I'm like, what are you doing? He's like, I'm celebrating you. I'm like, okay. And so teaching people how God delights in them, how they can delight in themselves, and how they can find healing and wholeness through their process, but also choosing, 1, to be present in their process, and 2, to celebrate their process, and doing that with a community and with God, I think is life-changing.
Anita, I'm so impressed. I'm so encouraged by, first of all, how clearly you have this. You understand this. You've experienced God. You see where God stepped into your life numerous times, and you're passionate about this. And I guess I'm kind of amazed, not because it's you, but because it feels like from where you described you were to where you are. And I think about my own life journey and the podcasting I've done in the last year, and how it feels like it's taken me 55 years to kind of get where you are, or 56 years to get to this place that I recognize that when I get up in the morning, I don't have to experience shame from God or condemnation from God. This week I was meeting with God, and I remembered that verse in Romans 2. I couldn't remember where it was, but I just remember that verse that says, it's the kindness of God that leads us to repentance. And I went back and I looked at that. I looked at it in the Greek to make sure it really was kindness, and it was kindness. It's the God's kindness. It's His compassion for us. It's His care. It's His acceptance. But it takes some of us, a long, long time to get there. And I just think you have and you got there through all of this kind of maze of being suicidal and sorting through what it meant to be who you are as a trans adoptee, and I guess I just want to say to you, I hope you never take this for granted that this is where you've gotten so early in life, because you have so much to offer. And I thank you for sharing what you have. It's very powerful. It's very powerful. And let me ask you this: how does so many of your peers would have given up on God by now, or have given up on God, or have not maybe given up on God but aren't where you're at? So what do you say to your peers who are kind of at a place of seeking? I call them the diaspora. They're kind of not giving up on God necessarily, but don't have the kind of clarity that you have. What do you say to them, or how do you encourage them, or how do you,
I would say,
yeah.
first of all, that they're not alone, and to keep seeking and to keep searching, and maybe engage in spaces of community that they haven't before. But I think community, and in my life, discipleship and mentorship have been huge. Like, I wouldn't be where I am or who I am had it not been for the dozens of people who have walked with me on this journey. So I would say definitely keep searching, and know that you're not alone, and engage in community. I don't know how I would articulate it beyond that.
What caused you to be open, though, to being mentored, to being discipled? Because I think there has to be an openness on your part to receiving that and to acknowledging that that's important. What about who you are kind of made you open to that?
I think my first recollection of discipleship or mentorship was part of a church where, as preteens, our church would connect us with other people in the church who wanted to mentor. And then from there, I realized that there's so much wisdom, and there's so much, like, friendship is a beautiful thing. And I gained a lot, and I learned a lot from that initial mentor at church. And then throughout all of my other educational pursuits, I realized that was something that I've had a high value for, and I needed it to be a constant in my life. So I don't know if that answers your question. I think the institute.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think the fact that it was kind of given to me and almost mandated in a way was really, really helpful. And then through that experience, because it was such a positive experience, I've been open to it, and I've searched it out and asked people, be like, hey, will you mentor me? I don't know what it looks like, but I would love to see where this goes.
And I think what I meant was, by don't take it for granted, was not kind of telling you what to do as much as saying to you, I tell my students all the time, Anita, their lives are sacred. Whether they know it or not, I tell them, look, theologically, you may not be where I'm at, and that's okay. But I believe that God has created your life, and that God has plans for your life, and that your life is sacred. But so many of them haven't been told that before. And so I think what I meant by don't take it for granted is just, you have been able to identify, it feels to me like earlier than some, that your life is sacred, that there's something sacred about who you are and what God's called you to be, and his love for you. And I think that's an amazing story. How are the podcast, blog, and book related to one another, if at all?
So part of the purpose for the blog is a way to, in a way, engage people in interest in reading the book. Haven't quite gotten there yet, because the tentative publishing date for the book is January, February of this upcoming year. And the podcast, I like spoken word a lot, and I don't really have an outlet at this point to do it. And so part of my purpose for that was to do spoken word pieces, but also I did 3 Facebook Live conversations with my twin sister talking about adoption, transracial adoption, and identity, belonging, in relationships. And so it was kind of a way to also give an outlet to the communication part of my blog and have people who didn't want to read them to listen to them.
And how is race part of this? You talked about the last year was challenging, difficult, however you described that. How has being a transracial adoptee the last year been impacted all of this for you?
I've found myself in a lot more conversations where I have been pointedly asked to identify as a Black person. And that probably, my first experience with that was at Messiah my first year. My mentor was a leader of the Black Student Union, and she sat me down and asked me, so Anita, when are you going to identify as an African American woman? And my answer was that Blackness is not a monolith. It means so many different things in so many different arenas and circumstances in the person that you're talking to. And so for me, I hadn't at that point grappled with my identity in terms of race. God and I were on a conversation of like, you are my child, and that is good. That is good. And so I spent most of my life coming to that point and coming to that conclusion and being excited about that. So for me to add another layer of, well, what does it mean to be an African American woman in today's society? I didn't know. And so I think with all of the legislation and all of the things happening in our culture around social justice and racial reconciliation, those conversations have been more heightened and more prominent. And so I find myself again in spaces where I haven't figured out what that means for me to identify as an African American woman. I don't know, I think it's an ongoing discovery and it's an ongoing journey. So I think the last year specifically with the George Floyd trials and all of that have made that conversation come to the forefront a lot more, which is kind of a part of how I got to the transracial adoption conversations and thought that race, especially I think in the church, is something that we haven't addressed. And there's a lot more conversations to be had in the church regarding race and racial reconciliation and what that looks like in light of our social justice stances, and what does that mean, and who creates those definitions for us.
So what would you like to say to the church, or what do you say to the church? And I'm thinking particularly the white church generally, about these issues you've been thinking about.
In looking at the white church, I think we need to look at what love looks like and come back to how Jesus interacted with all people, and how he treated them with dignity and respect, and how he sought equity and equality. And I think we need to in some ways go back to the drawing board and look at our theological beliefs and see how they line up, and how they create spaces where people are loved. Are they inclusive? Do they value all people regardless of cultural heritage or beliefs, or do they create division? And I think if they create division, maybe we need to take another look at them and see if we can do something different and maybe love a little bit more.
So you somehow believe that unity and love are a part of the Christian journey?
I believe they're important, yes.
Yes. What a lot of your peers have given up on church, and you don't need to answer this question, of course, unless you want to, but where are you with church? How do you see church?
Church Big C is the church that I attend.
No, I would say church with a big C, yeah.
I have hope for the church. I think Yes, I have a great hope for the church. And I think COVID has given us a great opportunity to go back to the basics, and return to the foundation of what it is we believe, and have an opportunity to reevaluate where we are, and is what we're doing working for us, and what we do believe, and how do we treat one another, and what does love look like. I think, yeah. And I don't know what to say to my peers who have left the church. I understand why a lot of my peers have left the church, and there's no blame, there's no shame, there's no guilt there, I don't think there should be. And I'm sorry that they're hurting, and I would love to have conversations with them. And I wish the church would create spaces where people who have left could maybe have those conversations about, okay, what is going on, and how do we hear each other's hearts, and how do we make this more of how are people loved, and how are they valued, and why have you left, and help us understand. So I wish that the church and those who have left would create spaces to come together where agreement is not the priority, but understanding is. And I think when that is done, there will be a lot more healing, and there'll be healing and a lot more wholeness. And I think we would have better vision to move forward.
You put that very, very well. I mean, well isn't the right word. You put that you put that together succinctly and concisely, the value of the church and why the church is important, and some counsel for the church about creating these spaces. I really love what you said there. And I think I've also heard you say that the community is important to you, and discipleship and mentoring. And so I'm assuming you're seeing the church as a vehicle that can provide those things if it chooses to do so. It's a space to do that. Is that right?
If the church chooses to do so, yes, I believe they can be, are, and will continue to be a vehicle to build community and safe spaces of healing and hope that can bring the transformative love and power of God to the world. Yes.
You put things so nicely, Anita. What do you hope to do? So you've got all of these plans already of what you're doing and how God's leading you. What's kind of in the future, is if you could think about the next 10, 15 years, what's out there?
That's a really good question, and something I continually have been asking myself the last 2 months. Well, in 2 years, I'll graduate with my master's degree, and part of me is contemplating seminary. I'm always like, oh, when I have time to do seminary for fun, I will go do seminary for fun, because I love hermeneutics and exegetical studies and reading the Bible and theologians and all of that. I find that it's fun for me. But I don't know if that's in the 10-year plan. I think after my master's, I will pursue becoming a licensed clinical social worker. And I am toying around with the idea of what would it look like to create a home, having a farmette type place for people of diverse backgrounds to come and stay, but also have part of that maybe be for sexual assault, domestic violence victims as well, where they can and have people to do job skills training, counseling, home ec, have a huge kitchen where they can be taught the skills of how to cook, how to bake, all of those things, and you just give them life skills and job skills. But I also want to have a space for a community where people can gather together and build fellowship. But that's something that I'm trying to figure out how that would work and what that would look like. And that would probably not be for at least 7 years with all of the education that I'm hoping to complete.
Anita, I remember when I was your age, that older people, like myself now, used to say how encouraging it was to hear younger folks talking about faith and serving in the church and serving Christ. And now I get it. Now I understand why that is. And as I listen to you, I feel the same way. It's just really, really encouraging. And I just want you to know that those of us who have been down the road further and ahead of you just really are cheering you on and just really want to see you continue to be able to do all that God's called you to do, and that's very exciting to see. And I really appreciate you sharing your story with us today. We've had some conversation earlier, and as we end, is there anything, I'm putting you on the spot, but you asked me a lot of questions the last time we met. Is there any question you want to ask me now, this third time that we've chatted, before we close? And if not, it's no problem.
Actually, there is, and I listened to the recording of it, and I would love to hear it iterated. But before our first conversation, your view on social justice and your current view of social justice and how the church plays into that, could you tell me a little bit about that journey and how you see that playing out in the church Big C?
How I see what playing out, Anita?
Social justice as you would define it now and how you defined it then.
Did you see a difference in the way that I defined it then and now?
I saw there was that social justice also includes, justice is also in tandem with grace. Yeah. And I found that your articulation of your definition of justice now to be much more broad. And I was wondering how you saw that being applied to larger society and church as a whole.
Oh, that's an interesting question. And I don't know, I may need more time to think through that. But I did have this kind of epiphany that one day when I was thinking about, I saw these qualities of God as his justice and God's grace as being kind of separate. But I think you're probably asking the question related to that one episode where I talked about them being the same. Is that the one? Yeah. Now you put me on the spot, Anita.
My apologies.
No, there's no apology needed. I think probably it's been part of my own journey as I've come to see the justice of God within the broader, as I've come to understand the love of God more clearly. I think it has impacted the way I see the justice of God, and the way I see that getting played out in my own life, but also in society as a whole. I don't know that I've changed in the way that I think the church has failed to be concerned about justice. I think we haven't seen justice as part of the love of God, that the church continues to separate out these two. And I just talked to someone recently, Anita, who talked about the fact that in the church, particularly the Anabaptist community, we haven't seen unity as part of faithfulness. That you're either faithful or you focus on unity. So if it comes down to some of the big issues the churches struggle with, whether it's sexuality or other kinds of things, some would say, well, we're faithful and that means we can't be with you. We have to divide. Others would say, well, it's unity that God is up to and it's most important. And this person was just saying that we haven't seen unity in the chapter of John 17 where Jesus prays for unity. It's really being part of what it means to be faithful. Unity is secondary to that. And I think that's part of what I'm kind of wrestling with right now is what does it mean to believe that unity and love are part of faithfulness? And what did Jesus mean in John 17? What did Jesus mean? Was he talking about the church with a big C only? Or did he mean that down where two or three are gathered, there should be unity even when we don't see eye to eye? And I'm not there yet, but I'm struggling with that. So I think probably what you're hearing and seeing is just the wrestling through that. I'm speaking to a group of leaders on Saturday about racial justice. And it's been hard for me to hear things coming from white Christians about some of these things. And so it's been hard for me to be empathetic with them. It's been hard for me to be loving, perhaps, and gracious, or tolerant, because I don't think there is, sometimes tolerance is not what's needed. It's the truth that's needed, but somehow that's still not separate from justice and love. So I'm rambling. I'll have to get back to you on that one. You've caused me to think about that more.
I think you said that very succinctly, because
it took me 5 minutes. It wasn't succinct.
Well, truth and justice and love are all go hand in hand.
Yes.
And they're all a part of unity. And I think there's a flow to that. And I think, yes, that John 17 is both to the unity of persons when two or more are gathered, but also to the larger body.
Yeah. Anita, it is always a pleasure and a blessing to chat with you. You're incredibly articulate about some of these things. It has taken me a lot longer than you to think through. So thank you for being with us. And we'll have to connect again sometime. And I'll check in again how you're doing in your podcast blog. And when your book comes out, we'll have to have you back to promote your book. And audience, you can check this out on my YouTube channel on Thursday, which is the 24th, I think. 24th, or I don't know, it's next week, the week of the 20th. I'll post this on YouTube, but also on my podcast, The Church Dismantled, A Kingdom Restored. Our guest has been Anita Garber. Anita, thank you for joining us. God's blessing to you.
Thank you.
All right.